All right, so um, this is our fourth lesson in our study of the kings and prophets. This is kind of the Cold War period for the history of Israel. It's not only because the kingdom of God's people is divided, but it's they start interacting as though they are enemies or rivals, and so tensions are high. Where we kind of left off last week in 1 Kings 11, Rehoboam is still king, or he's anointed king. He rallies the people and he is to be anointed. But at this same time, Jeroboam, one of the rivals of Solomon, comes before them and he claims, "No, you are not to be king. The prophet Ahijah promised that the king will be stripped away from you, and this fulfillment has this promise has come to fruition." Let me get a little rowdy out there. And so the kingdom is divided. We have in the north the kingdom of Israel, and in the south the kingdom of Judah. Judah's capital is that of Jerusalem, and it's been the capital of the kingdom since the time of David. It never moves. However, the kingdom in the north, they keep moving the capital. It will start off at the beginning with Jeroboam having the capital in Bethel, which is just north of Ai and Jericho, which we remember from the stories of Joshua. But then later on, the Amorites move the capital to Samaria, which is, of course, where we get the term Samaritans, which show up in later on as lost connection. So let me get that back up there. But the Samaritans, it's not only just the capital. Samaria is where the capital is for the northern kingdom. These people from the area of Samaria, when the Assyrians come in and destroy the northern kingdom, the people that are left around the capital, they are the ancestors of the Samaritans because they intermarry with the Assyrians and the Babylonians as they come into the land. And so, just a few, I guess, notes. The slides are going to start being different colors. They're not just going to be blue anymore. So it's a little bit easier to tell where our story is going. What we're going to have is red slides for the kingdom of Judah, and then this lighter blue color for the kingdom of Israel. Just so we can kind of separate the two, just because the way for, the Kings reads is we'll be talking about Judah, and then we'll suddenly just switch to Israel, and then we'll go further than when we were talking about Judah, and then we'll go back to talk about Judah. And so I'm going to kind of keep it close to the same kind of line, but I'm also going to try and untangle some of that mess as well. So like we have been doing the family tree, however, once we get past David, they stop listing all the people. The really important ones is who's the father of which king. And so as it's been, David, Solomon, Rehoboam are all of the tribe of Judah. And Rehoboam has a son Abijam. But after the kingdom is stripped from Rehoboam, or at least the northern 10 tribes, is what we get is the author of Kings says we are not talking about Rehoboam for a while. We're going to talk about Jeroboam. And so Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, is of the tribe of Ephraim, and he has a son Nadab. And so what Jeroboam ends up doing is he begins. He was brought up as a rival for King Solomon. He was Solomon had married 700 wives. He had devoted time and energy to serving all those wives' gods, but they had not devoted any time to serving God himself. And so Solomon lost favor in the eyes of the Lord. And then at the beginning of Jeroboam's reign, it's very similar to the beginning of Solomon's reign. They thought that Jeroboam was going to be this great king, that he was going to be the one to do what God has asked him to do. However, it doesn't take long for, once he's in power, to begin worshiping idols. And for Jeroboam, it's most significantly the golden calf. He sets up an altar in let's go back to the map, in Dan, and one of the most northern parts of the kingdom of Israel. It's still one of the most northern parts of modern day Israel. It's in the weird territory. It's the Golan Heights area. It's the area that Israel and Syria have been arguing over who has proper legal authority over, if that helps any of y'all. But so he builds these golden calves, and a bunch of Jeroboam gets a bunch of no-name prophets that prop up. And so what happens is, as he builds this great golden calf in Dan, Jeroboam is making a big point, and the prophet is challenging him, saying, no, you need to turn away from your idols, turn away from these false gods, devote yourself to serving God like you've been told to do. And Jeroboam says, I'm going to choose to worship the God that I choose, and I choose to worship the golden calf. And at that moment, Jeroboam, Jeroboam is described as this muscular man. He's a warrior of a king. He's not scrawny like the child David was. He's not. He's muscular and strong. And so when he points to the golden calf, his arm shrivels up, and it's just skin and bone. And it looks like he is like everything had just been drained from his arm, is how it's kind of described. And so it startles him into this kind of pleading to the prophet, pray to God that I may get my arm back. It spooked him in this moment. And of course, Jeroboam regains his muscle mass in his arm. But yet again, he continues to worship these golden calves. And so he builds more and more of these sanctuaries, and they don't learn. And so yet another nameless prophet comes before Jeroboam and says, once again, you are doing what God has not told you to do. You're worshiping idols. You're choosing to serve what you want to serve and not what God wants to happen. And so Jeroboam kind of backs away from, okay, fine, I'll listen to you because you're a prophet of God. And because as this prophet comes, he's beginning to speak larger curses than, oh yeah, your arm's just going to shrivel up. It's the kingdom will be ripped away from you. Your son will be slaughtered before you. And Jeroboam's like, these are way too high of prices for dealing with a no-name prophet. But what Jeroboam ends up doing is he sends another prophet. What we'll see in Kings is there's the prophets of the Lord, the prophets that God sends to the kings, but then there's prophets that serve the king. We'll see this later with Ahab. He has a council of prophets that are all telling him to go into battle against the Moabites. And then there's the prophet of God who says, don't listen to them, they're deceiving you. If you go up, you will die. And they're like, how do you know this? And it's like, because I saw God debating this with the spirits of what we're to do with you. And so this is a long story. We'll talk about it here in a couple of weeks. But the idea is that there's prophets that are just saying what the king wants to hear. And then there's prophets who are saying what God wants them to say. And so Jeroboam sends one of these prophets that are loyal to him and says, go after that no-name prophet and convince him to stay with you. Now, this no-name prophet had been given a command from God saying, do not stop until you return to the southern kingdom. Like, he was just, he is a prophet who has come up from the south to minister to the north. This is something that happens quite a bit. Elijah and Elisha are from the south, but they prophesy in the north. And so we kind of see this pattern already forming. God is calling good men up to serve in wherever they're needed. However, this prophet thinks, well, this is another prophet who says he's from God and is inviting me to eat. What harm could do this? What harm could come to me? Um, and so he stops and eats. This prophet who's serving Jeroboam instead of God has deceived God's prophets. And of course, this is one of those weird stories. But a lion then comes and kills the prophet of God because he did not do the thing God had asked him to do. And it's one of those moments where it seems really harsh for this was just a prophet who was deceived. And I'm sure we all fall into deception at times where we're deceived by people claiming to know God. So God then punishes the prophet for misunderstanding. But I think this goes back to the lesson of what we've kind of already seen of you're not listening to God. And so God is setting an example. We saw this with David and Uzziah. Uzziah was struck down for touching the ark of God. He didn't necessarily do anything wrong, but he didn't listen to the commands of God and the law of Moses. He didn't. This was more of on David. And I think once again, this not only the prophet did what was wrong before God, but I think part of this is also a message back to Jeroboam of God has power over animals, and no matter what you think you're doing, you're not safe. No matter how you can think your way out of this, whatever plan you think you might be able to get away with, God has control over these little things that you aren't even calculating. And so it continues. And so Jeroboam's son falls sick. And so Jeroboam sends his wife, go get the prophet Ahijah. This is the prophet who last week tore the cloak and into 12 strips and said, take 10 and God will keep one and the descendants of Solomon will keep one because God will not tear away the kingdom from the descendants of David. And so this woman disguises herself and tries and goes and finds this prophet. But similar to the story of Saul in Acts, when he is blind, but God still comes to him and tells him where to go. This prophet is told, Jeroboam's wife's coming to you. Do not be deceived by what she says. You are to go with her to Jeroboam, and his child is to be healed. But this is not good news for Jeroboam. The kingdom will still be torn away from Jeroboam. And so, very shortly after, Jeroboam has the kingdom torn away from him. And we get King Nadab. Now, in the south, what we see is Rehoboam is beginning to reign. He is described as greedy and ungodly. He is amassing advisors who are foolish and young. I'm not saying all young people are foolish, but he doesn't listen to the wisdom of his elders. Solomon was one of the wisest men, the wisest man to ever live. Maybe only second to Christ. But he had a council of wise men who heard the things of Solomon, who had read what Solomon had written. And this is part of the reason why the kingdom is ripped away from Rehoboam, is because in the beginning of Rehoboam's reign, Solomon is described as a building king. He built great works, and so Rehoboam has basically the union heads or these master carpenters who come before him and say, your father gave us a lot of work. We are tired of doing work. Give us a little bit of rest and we will serve you to the ends of the earth. And Rehoboam's wise counsel, who had lived with his father and who had heard the sayings and teachings of Solomon, said, do what they ask. They're telling the truth. If you give them a little bit of rest, they will thank you for it. They'll be more dedicated to you than they would have ever been with Solomon. And they were super loyal to Solomon. Look at all the things they built. But Rehoboam then goes to his young friends who haven't been in leadership, who hadn't done anything. And the young people that he surrounded himself with are foolish and say, Rehoboam, look at the works your father did. Look at those things that he was able to accomplish. Think of what you might be able to accomplish if you push him harder, if you give him more work to do. Think of all the things you can achieve. And so Rehoboam decides, I'm going to listen to these fools, these inexperienced guys, and I'm going to put my weight behind them. And so Rehoboam loses favor with the people. He begins to lose favor even within the tribe of Judah. And he turns away from God. Similar to Jeroboam, he builds up standing stones and Asherahs. These are things that will show up time and time again. Standing stones are this picture on the left. These are just random stones that are stood up. In the ancient Near East, this is described as where gods would stand during the day. Think of it how in those portrayals of Greek mythology, they're all standing on top of columns, right? It's the same idea. These gods of other nations stand on these giant stones that we set up. That's where they reside. And so they'll create monuments basically to their gods. And they'll inscribe, oh, this stone's where so-and-so stands. This is where Baal stands during the day and during certain seasons, because they attribute almost everything to a god in the ancient Near East. But then they have Asherah poles. Asherah poles were wooden carved statues who said that there is Yahweh, God, this God of the Old Testament. God who gave us these laws on Mount Sinai, who led us out of Egypt, out of captivity. Sure, that's who's led us into the land, but he also has a wife. God never says he has a wife, but they say God has a wife, and it's Asherah, this mother nature type figure. And they say this will become a problem later on, where they start attributing more things to Asherah than just nature and weather. And it's one of those things that they're creating gods and trying to force them into this idea of, well, there's Yahweh, but he's sometimes falls secondary to his wife, Asherah. They're trying to make it sound like Yahweh has the same kind of hierarchy of these other gods, of the Canaanites and the Sidonian gods. That these gods are all families, and there's one over the sea, and there's one over the wind, and there's one over the fire. And they all came from this coupling that is represented by these two major factors. The Greeks have you have the god of the earth and the god of the sky, and that's where all the other gods came from. And the Romans steal it and change their names. But they're trying to do that same thing with Yahweh. And this starts to really grab hold in the southern kingdom, especially under Rehoboam. But what God does is he raises up Egypt to challenge the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom never really gets to escape being tormented by Egypt in this divided kingdom. We even see it, we'll see it in Jeremiah here in a couple weeks. God raises up the pharaohs to come and plague the kings of Judah. And it's one of those, in this moment, God brings up this pharaoh who's a nobody at this point. Looking at Egyptian history, the pharaoh that God chooses to bring up is fresh on the scene. He has done nothing. He hasn't built anything. He only becomes pharaoh because he was the second cousin of the last remaining pharaoh, and he had no sons. And so they picked the closest male heir, and that just happens to be him. And so he comes and he leads this grand military campaign into Judah, and he ends up stealing away the gold items of the temple. Solomon spent a lot of wealth building up and making the temple very beautiful. And again, it happens over and over again. Every time the people of Judah turn away from God, God brings up someone and they steal all the wealth away from the temple, away from the king. And so the king always ends up bringing it back, but that's also because they have good kings who are blessed with wealth. Rehoboam is not one of those good kings. He's a rather lousy king. And so the Pharaoh's army comes in and subjugates of the people and steals away their gold. And that leads to the death of Rehoboam. And so Abijam comes on the scene, but he is not very, he doesn't last very long. He gets a reference as he becomes king, and then he dies. And so Rehoboam's grandson, Asa, becomes king. Don't worry, Abijam is not the shortest lived king. We'll get to him in a second. But Asa is a good king. What he does is he does the opposite of what his grandfather and father did. He tears down these idols. He tears down these temples, these standing stones, these Asherahs. He cleans away the rubble, and he removes them from the city of Jerusalem. What had happened since Solomon and carried on through Rehoboam and Abijam, the kings would just build idols and statues to their gods and Asherahs and standing stones all across the city of Jerusalem. And sure, there was the temple that was right next to the palace. But even then, they would try and put more gods around the temple. So yeah, they're going to the temple, but they're not worshiping God within the temple. They're not going and serving with the Levitical priests. So Asa, at the beginning of his reign, he's one of the few good kings that Israel and Judah will have. And he tears down these idols. This is a common theme we'll see. The good kings, no matter what they do, they tear down the idols. You have good kings who tear them down. You have sort of good kings who do good things, but they don't tear down all of the idols. And then you have terrible kings who build idols, who turn away from God, who lead the people astray. But of course, then king switches back to the northern kingdom. And so then we get Nadab. Nadab begins his reign. He continues in the sins of his father. He builds idols. And so God raises up Baasha. There's no artist depictions besides like this of Baasha. And it was because there was someone who, I guess, a while ago wanted to make like stamps of all the kings, and that's all I can find of some of these kings as far as pictures. Baasha comes to power. He kills Nadab, and so what we get is Baasha becomes king of Israel. He is of the tribe of Issachar, and his son Elah will be king later. But what Baasha is known for is he is the king to actually raise an army against the southern kingdom. He goes into battle against God's people, and it becomes one of those dividing factors. People are not happy that he's marching against Baasha, but in the battle he dies, and his son Elah becomes king. The kings when they go up to battle. The next couple kings, when they go up to battle, they don't live very long because they're acting out of hubris. And so what we get is there's these campaigns. Eventually, a peace is struck between the northern and southern kingdom. When Baasha dies, Elah doesn't really feel like it is necessary for him to go and continue this war against the people of Judah, and he has generals advising him, don't do this, don't keep fighting this, because what they've seen is losses repeated over and over and over again. And so instead of fighting the southern tribe of Judah, they decide, let's go fight the Sidonians, because they're a smaller enemy. If we go back to our map, the Sidonians, it's the same area of that Sidon has always been in. And so Sidonia is around Sidon, but it's really just around Sidon. There is no other real city under the Sidonian control. Sure, there's Tyre, it's a neighboring city, but that's not owned by the Sidonians. So they're thinking, oh, this is going to be easy. We're fighting one city. How hard can that be? We couldn't possibly suffer the losses that we see when we were fighting the kingdom of Judah. I'm really struggling with words tonight. I'm sorry. But then, as Elah is leading this military campaign. One of his generals, Zimri, comes up and says, "Why are we fighting? This doesn't make any sense to me." Zimri was the captain of the chariots of the Northern Kingdom. He's a very influential leader for the armies. And so what happens is he goes and kills the king. And so Elah is dead, and Zimri pulls the troops out of fighting the Sidonians, and he goes back back to Bethel to sit on the throne and crown him king, and he lasts all of 7 days. He does not last long. And so Zimri is of the tribe of Simeon, and that's all we need. Because then we get the Omrides, led by Omri. He may not be the leader of the chariots, but he was one of the generals of that fought with the foot troops. And so, yeah, it took him longer to get back to Bethel because he's walking. He doesn't have a horse pulling him. But what happens is he goes into Bethel and begins to kill everyone who opposes him. It's very much a full-on revolution. He's throwing off their power. And of course, Zimri dies 7 days later after sitting down on the throne. But a part of the problem is we have two powerful factions. You have Tibni, who is one of Omri's, I guess, commanders. And we do know his father's name. It's Ginath, which he is one of the only kings of the tribe of Manasseh. But we have Omri, who goes back to the tribe of Issachar, the same, which was the same descendants of Abishah and Elah. Many think Omri was kind of a cousin or somehow related to that original family, just because of how it seems he's so connected and emboldened with the killing of Elah by Zimri. But he could also just be really loyal to the king. It's not a foreign concept that generals are loyal to the king. And so Omri is given half the kingdom of Israel, and Tibni is given the others, and it's a very short 7 years before Tibni dies. And then so, of course, that leaves Omri, and he has the son Ahab. I'm realizing I'm flying through this thing. And so what Omri does is he returns the sins of Jeroboam. Like, he returns to those original sins. He builds more idols. He builds more temples to foreign gods, and he worships them. He doesn't necessarily worship the same gods that Jeroboam worshipped. He's not worshiping the same gods that even Abishah and Elah are following. But what we do see is he continues to add more gods to what the Israelites are supposed to be worshiping. He's adding to the people. He's confusing them. He's leading them away. But Omri is, as we mentioned, the one to move the capital of Israel from Bethel to Samaria. And so we don't get a whole lot more about him other than he led a revolution against Zimri, who's somehow related to Baasha, and he moves the capital and continues to lead the people of Israel into the sins of Jeroboam. He's deceiving them. He's adding more to their gods. He's building altars to these men and deceiving them. And of course, he dies. What we see with the northern kings, they don't last as long as the southern kings, because all the while Asa has been reigning for like 40 years uninterrupted. He's doing the will of God. He is not really facing any military attacks. He's not having to go up and defend the cities of Judah. Rather, he is just simply reigning and doing what is right before God, and God is blessing him for that. And so that's another sign of he was a good king. He lasted longer than like 12 years. Most kings they don't last that long. We saw Zimri lasted 7 days, and but a lot of these kings are lasting 5 years, 7 years, 2 years. Omri lasts, I think, 12, and then that leads to his son Ahab. I guess we can do a lot of setup for next week. Next week we're looking at Elijah, but what we see is Ahab is king, of course, during Elijah, and what we see Ahab does is he does everything his father did, but worse. And what his father did was what every king did before him, but worse. And we're seeing with the tribes of, not the tribes of Israel, the kings of Israel is one of them would do bad, and the next one would do worse, and the next one would do worse, and the next one would do worse. And they would, the prophets would be raised up, and they would try and turn it around, and the people may turn around, but the kings of Israel never did. You see on the opposite side, the kings of Judah, there are some who are very repentant. There are those who are quick to turn around with prophets. But those kings, until the end, are really nameless prophets, not kings. Those prophets in the south are very nameless. Yes.
Bergan, do you know if there's any existence of these tombs of these kings in Jerusalem today?
There are, not necessarily of the kings of Israel, because they're in the north and their capital kept moving until they settle in Samaria. But there are tombs in that they found in the area of Jerusalem. I'm gonna probably I'm gonna butcher his name. And now I just lost it. Let's see. I have it probably somewhere. It's King Uzziah is one of the more notable tombs that they've found, and that's just because his tomb kept getting moved because he was a leper. He's the king. We'll see this in a couple weeks, but he becomes angry with the priest because he wants to do like his great grandfather did. He wants to wear the ephod. He wants to do the thing of the priest because he's trying. He hears the story of what his great grandfather David did. David wore the ephod. He was able to have that relationship with God on a more priestly role. Uzziah is not in that role. God is very clear that no, you are not to do this. The Levites are my people. And what happens is King Uzziah goes in and storms in the temple, and he goes to strike down a Levite, and in the moment he breaks out with leprosy on his forehead, and it's described he's screaming in pain because it's describes the author of Kings, and it's later recorded in the Chronicles as well, of what the king screams out like. It's hot ash that just falls on his head, but he's breaking out in leprosy in the moment, and so he becomes a leprous king. He is never allowed to then be king anymore. He may be king. He's not allowed in the palace. He's not allowed near the people. He has to go live outside the walls of Jerusalem. He has to do all of that. Well, the same thing happened with his tomb. They would have the tomb of the king. It had to be sealed. It had to be specially marked because this is a leper's grave. It's not just any other grave. And so what happened was even into when Nehemiah goes and rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem, brings the people back from exile in Babylon, and even after all the Roman influence comes in, and even after all the Ottomans come in, what we saw, or what we can see, is they kept moving the tomb of Uzziah further and further away from the city. And so when archaeologists started digging around, once I guess that's the 50s, once Israel started being repopulated by Jews, what we saw is they would come and they'd do these mass archaeological digs, and the first grave they find is Uzziah's because it's clearly marked. It's marked as this is the tomb of a leper. He has very special inscriptions. By the time the body had degraded enough to where there's no possibility to really test the DNA or get any of that kind of evidence to, well, let's see who's in the line of David. It's more of, they got the coffin. They could find the coffin because it was stone, it was an ornate box, because this is still a king. It's not necessarily just Joe Schmo the leper. It's King Uzziah. He has money, he has the wealth, but what we saw is in the South is they're able to find evidence of where these kings were buried.
You know, the oil that David was anointed with, that recipe has come down to thousands of years. And it's used in Britain for the crowning of their kings. So the same recipe.
And so we can kind of already see this history. It seems so long ago. I don't know about you guys when you read the Bible. When you read your Bible, not when you read the Bible. It's something we should all be reading all the time. Some of these stories seem like they're, oh, that was forever ago. And then you look at it and you're like, that's like, we have way older stuff than this, where people will make an argument of, oh, that happened millions of years ago. And I'm like, the Bible happened maybe 3,000 years ago. Like, David was alive 3,000 years ago. And so these stories aren't as old as we think. And it goes to show, yeah, we think some of these like great empires and great kingdoms, they're going to last forever. And then when you look at it, the long scheme of things, there's certain things that will last. There's certain things that won't. But I'm sure when you're in the northern kingdom, as they're approaching exile, they're looking around and they're saying, the Assyrians will last forever. They're built to succeed. They're built to win every battle. Well, until the Babylonians show up. And then they're saying, well, the Babylonian Empire will last forever until the Persians show up. And the Persians say, well, the Persians are going to last forever until the Greeks show up. And then the Greeks are like, we're going to last forever. And then Alexander dies and then they crumble and the Romans just happen to be able to be there to pick up the pieces. But even then we see the Romans say, well, we'll be the ones to last forever. And there'll be those who still argue, well, Rome is still alive because they transferred the capital to the Eastern Empire, and the Eastern Empire then transferred the capital to the Russian Empire, and the Russian Empire is still around because the Russian Federation still claims ties to the Orthodox Church to be the Eastern Roman Empire. And then you have to sit there and say, no, that's not how that works. You can't just say that can't happen. You can't just say, oh, yeah, totally. There was a lost tribe of Israel and they came to the Americas. That's not how things work. Sorry. It's that same kind of idea of you can't just transfer them willy-nilly and make things up about history. There are historical truths. These kings are historically true. I didn't plan on going this way. I promise. But something I did find interesting, there's a couple of years ago, I say a couple, it's older than I am. It's late 70s, early 80s, a couple years ago. Up until that point, people didn't think King David was real. They thought he was one of those mythical kings. We can look at the kings of the Vikings, the kings of some of these empires. Yeah, it's those like very first ones. We can tell where their sons are, but we can't necessarily point to, okay, this was a real person, or if this was just some legend that they spun. And so up until that point, they kind of had that idea of David. Yes, we know Solomon is here. We have archaeological evidence that Solomon was here. You know, the kingdom divided. We have historical records of this, which is convenient that they say we have historical records of the divided kingdom and all this coming from the biblical era. But they say, yeah, the records of the history of the kings of Israel that are recorded in the Bible, that doesn't count because they like picking and choosing what sources they like to believe. Anyway, so what they find is what's called the Tel Dan inscription. Again, this is an archaeological find in Dan, which is where Jeroboam built that golden calf from earlier. Northernmost part of the kingdom of Israel, northernmost part of the tribes of Israel, the northernmost part of current day Israel, pretty much. But what it is this inscription detailing a parade David had. And it said the entire house of David was there. It's carved in stone. And it's one of the most important archaeological finds in, I guess, biblical archaeology, because it's one of those points where they say, see, he was real. That this is not just made up. And so if David's real, for us Christians, we can then say, well, if David's real, there's a real son in David, who's the promised Messiah, that is Jesus Christ. He is a real thing. It's not just some story Peter and James decided to make up and then die for in a gruesome death, which is still one of those very weird arguments of, well, the apostles just made Jesus up. The apostles died in worse ways than I think any of us want to die. Like, they did not have a great time leaving this earthly plane. Why would they do that for a made up story? Something they just made up. Because we have stories of people who were threatened with that and they immediately fold. So either they were really bought into this lie or it's the truth. It's something that they were willing to die for. Anyway, back to this inscription. It's one of those moments that prove that the king, that David had a far-reaching kingdom. Because at the time they also said, well, sure, King David may have been king, but he didn't reign all of Israel. Like, his kingdom wasn't that big. Because it's one of those, okay, we'll concede a little bit, but we're not conceding you the whole story. We're not telling you that the biblical account is accurate. It is, though, because this is one of those moments of, why would, okay, we say David built Jerusalem. You're conceding that point. Why would a king who resides in Jerusalem be this far north if this wasn't part of his kingdom? This is not only a Jewish settlement, but this is a place where the king of Israel comes. This is where David has come in a parade. So it's a long way of saying, yes, there's archaeological evidence of the kings. I hope that answers some of your questions. I guess we can, what else? What other questions do you have?
I guess I could kind of see why God didn't really want kings,
Sure.
because of the outcome. There were good kings, but the ones that were bad really did do some damage.
Yeah.
People and to God.
Sure.
Disrespect to God. I can see why that wasn't a high point in God's.
Sure. I forget who said this, but I heard it once and I like it. It's the idea of I don't remember why he was talking about politics, but he said all forms of government are hated by God, because especially democracies, because it takes the power of the people, the voice of what the people want, people's desires is what is most important. And he goes on to argue that means God must like monarchies and ultimate dictatorships. And then he said, but even then, God hates kings. And so it's one of those ideas of, sure, he'll let the people of Israel have a king. He'll let them have it. And the argument wasn't saying the United States government needs to be just become a king. It was more of one of those, he was kind of making a joke about what's going on. Because God does hate the kings. He dreaded the fact that people asked for it back in 1 Samuel. He tells Samuel, I'm going to give them a king, but I'm not going to like it. And so that's why it was so important that he had a king after his own heart, David. David was special because it was the closest thing to what God wanted from a king that none of the other kings lived up to. Like Asa, who's still currently alive when Ahab's on this scene. Asa's a good king. He tears down the idols, but he's no David. There won't be anything close to David until we get to Christ. And Christ is like David and then some. He's greater than David. He's greater than Moses. He's greater than Elijah. He's greater than these Hall of Fame individuals from the Old Testament. And so what we see is, yeah, God hates the fact that the people turned away from him. Basically. They want to be like the other people. They want to be like the nations who pick their own leaders, or have at least one person that they can point to and say, this is the king. This is who I'm going to give my money to from taxes and whatever. Which, yeah. And so we have this whole incidence where God clearly dreads the fact that these kings, that the people wanted the king. The people wanted Saul. God knew at that moment all of the terrible things that the kings of the northern kingdom would do. He knows all of the horrible things that the southern kingdom would do in their later years. He knows that there's going to be prophets that he raises up that no one's going to listen to because they have decided that I'm going to only do what I want. I'm going to follow my ways of sin. I'm going to follow my fleshly desires instead of sticking with what God has commanded. I'm not going to follow the law. I'm going to follow my heart. I'm going to follow what I want. And so, yeah, God hates kings. But I think at times he's willing to work with kings if it leads to his goal. He's willing to work with democracies and republics and theocracies and whatever other form of government. He's still working through whatever it is. He's going to still have prophets and apostles and disciples to form and push for what God is desiring.
Do you think it still would have turned, even if there hadn't been a king, kind of like when Moses delivered them out of Egypt and then the people decided, do you think they still would have done that anyway eventually? Well, it would have gone that way?
Oh, absolutely, because we even see with the judges.
Among the people, because
Among the people.
local.
Yeah, like what would happen is they would raise up judges, which for the longest time I thought, oh, he's just raising up a judge to be over an entire kingdom, just like a king. Well, no, the judges were raised up in a specific area. Usually it was an area that was being afflicted by the Philistines, or the Amalekites, or the Ammonites, or the Babylonites. and so it's one of those ideas of the people got restless of, one, they're not unified under one leader, or at least one human leader. Well, what we see is they were supposed to be unified under God. They're supposed to be one nation under God. They go to God. The Levites are supposed to meet them in this, because what the relationship was, it was supposed to be worship. It was supposed to be, that's how I communicate with my leader. How I communicate with the one who gives the law, who teaches me what I'm supposed to do. But even then, the cycle of the judges is you would have the people would turn away from God. God delivers them into the enemy's hand. The people cry out, God raises up a judge. They have peace, they have prosperity, they have deliverance because of God's blessing. They turn away from God. And the cycle just repeats over and over and over again. And it's not just on a national scale, it's very much local with the judges. But still one of those moments of a king wouldn't have necessarily changed that. The absence of a king wouldn't have changed it. We see this pattern from before the Exodus of the people want to do their own thing. Before they get the law, you have a group that's already saying, I want to go back to Egypt because I don't have to do a whole bunch of walking all the time. And I don't have to follow God and his rules and what I'm supposed to eat. I can just go back to Egypt. I can be a slave, because in slavery, I can still do what I want. I can still get away with those things. I don't have to listen to these rules. I don't have to listen to Moses. I wanted to go back to slavery because though I'll get beaten, though I have to do hard labor, though I'll be looked down upon, and the Pharaoh can snap his fingers and say, I want all of my children to be killed because of the race I am. I can still be independent. I can still do the sins I want to do. And I can still do what I think is right and not what God thinks is right. You mentioned the people did this with Moses in front of them. That's why Moses breaks the stone tablets, or the original copies of the Ten Commandments, because he's filled with rage, because he looks down These people have barely lasted a month and a half without Moses, and they've already gone back to what they were doing in Egypt. And it's one of those, I'm right there on top of the mountain where you can see it. Mountains aren't hard to miss, especially mountains with storm clouds on them and fires coming around and there's flashes of light. You can hear where the presence of God is, who's giving me the law, and you are still turning away from him. You're still ignoring him. You're still doing a sentence. Fast forward a little bit into Joshua. Joshua has to go, and we're having great military success. We are reconquesting the people of, we're conquesting the land of Canaan. You saw the walls fall of Jericho. All we did was walk around the city, and walls fell. We've had great successes. Sure, we got cursed a little bit because we messed up, and so yeah, we didn't have an undefeated record. But in these moments, you saw what we did. You saw how small our army was against how large their gates were, how big of the armies they had, and you still chose to follow and steal away idols and worship the idols of the Canaanites. And so at the end of Joshua, he comes to Samaria, or what will become Samaria, and has the people of Israel rededicate themselves to God. You have the mountain of cursing, the mountain of blessing, and they're making two sacrifices at once. Curse those who have done wicked in the land, God. Punish those who need to be punished, not because we hate them, but because we need to be brought to discipline. Bless those who have done good. We need to set up, we're trying to follow our laws. We want you to clearly guide us. And he says, and this is where we have signs all over the places in Hobby Lobby and Mardell, and it's in people's houses, and it's and for me and my household, I will follow. But for me and my household, I will follow the Lord. I went into too many friends' houses who were not going to church, but their mom had that sign in their house. And so it's still that idea of the people, we're still going to turn. We're having success. We're seeing God on the mountain with Moses, giving him the law, and we're going to turn from him. We're having great military success with Joshua, and we're still turning away from him. And Joshua has to blatantly say, you are doing wrong. You need to turn around. We have the judges who God has given us freedom. He's given us this ability in this land. We are not facing a whole lot of affliction, but it's only when we turn away from God that we ever get oppressed, that we ever have enemies come against us. We ask for a king, and yet the king will then lead us astray. We ask for deliverance, and God delivers us from the Saul and gives us David, and we have great success, but David still sins, and it leads us astray. Not as far as the others, but he does stumble at the end. And we see Solomon. Solomon asks for wisdom. He's wise. He knows what he's supposed to do. He knows what's right and wrong, and he leads the people astray. The kingdom's divided. God chooses the king for the north, and he decides that he'll leave Rehoboam in charge, and they both lead the people astray. It doesn't mean Jeroboam, though he was chosen by God, God made a mistake. There was something clearly there that God was trying to do. God did not just say, yeah, I'm going to make a mistake. I'm just going to pick a guy. It's the heart of man still having free will. God did choose Jeroboam for what he would be as a challenger to Solomon, what he represented. But he would then, Jeroboam decided, I'm going to turn away from God. I'm going to worship idols. I'm going to worship the golden calf, because that's where I'm going to put my trust. Not the king, not the God that chose me to be king. Not the God who gave me success, who gave me victory, who gave me that 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel to be leader of. I'm going to trust some other God. We can even see that today. We have plenty of people who say, I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to make idols. Maybe it's not the same way they did in the Old Testament. They're not carving trees to look like goddesses, and they're not setting up stones in the middle of along the road or in the middle of cities and saying, this is where so-and-so God of the harvest stands during this month on this day, and so we need to worship them and have festivals on that day. But there are things that people say, this is more important to me than God. God, whether they grew up in the church, whether they did this or that, they have moments where they're seeing God has delivered me through something terrible. And he's given me he's blessed me because I am a part of his creation. And yet they say, yeah, but God wants me to follow rules. He wants me to be a good person. And in a way I don't agree with, because I know what's best for me and what humanity wants, not God, the guy who created us and has the instruction manual. I know better because I am the one who was made. And that's the trap Ahab falls into. And we'll talk about him more. But what he does is he does wickedness. And the people start crying out. God sees his people. But luckily, there's a prophet that God chooses from land of Tishbe, random middle of nowhere town. Picks this guy and says, "You're going to be my prophet. And you're going to be, as Ahab says, the troubler of Israel," which is ironic, or maybe it's hypocritical, that Ahab is calling Elijah the troubler of Israel, even though Elijah's actually the one bringing discipline, who's bringing what God wants to the people of Israel. So that was a long time to spend on that last slide, but thank you for being here. Any other questions before? I don't want to just walk off. You guys saw it.